Hello and welcome to the second of our lectures on exploration and the Pacific Northwest. In this lecture, we'll talk about Russian exploration and Russian claims to the Pacific Northwest, and ultimately the American claims to the Pacific Northwest. Before we begin that story, I'd like to talk to you a little bit in just recapping what we did in the first lecture, because it was a lot. It was a long lecture, and it covered a lot of material. So to kind of recap, the Pacific Northwest is on the far edge of what we consider to be the era of exploration, right? It's near the end of that era. Also, remember that exploration is not simply discovering what's there, it's actively imperialistic. It is countries coming to claim resources and or actual territory. So when we're talking about exploration, what we're really talking about is an attempt to claim resources and territory on behalf of countries. And exploration is part of that process. You explore something, you map it, you chart it, you create trading posts, you do a few of those things, but regardless, you're building the case for why the country or kingdom you represent should have control over this land. That's what this is about. And the Pacific Northwest is the very end of a long process that began in the 1400s with Portuguese exploration in Africa and Columbus's initial expedition, the first of his expeditions in 1492. And since those 15th century moments, what has happened is European powers have gone and explored and claimed vast amounts of territory throughout the world. By the time the Pacific Northwest is being actively explored by European countries and the United States, European kingdoms and countries have created vast overseas empires. They've claimed a lot of territory. So the Pacific Northwest is part of this story, part of this larger global narrative. It's on the tail end of it. So keep that in mind. And the last point I'd like to make before moving on is that this process of exploration and imperialism is at the expense of indigenous peoples. That indigenous people who lived on the land for centuries, if not millennia, those indigenous peoples' right to live on the land have been their homeland for centuries upon centuries. That was not considered credible by Europeans and the United States. The rights of indigenous peoples were simply trampled during this process. Now, it's really important that you understand that indigenous peoples didn't necessarily comprehend that that's what was going on, in part because indigenous peoples don't have an understanding of the global perspective of what these European kingdoms and empires are doing, or later the United States. On the other hand, though, it's not as if the Europeans and later the Americans are transparent and honest about their aspirations and their desires. They're not actively saying in this period, later on, that's a different story, but in this period, they're not actually saying, oh, by the way, this land that you've lived on for centuries, it's now not yours any longer. You're subject to this other political entity or person or power or whatever that is thousands upon thousands of miles away. They're not saying that. Indigenous peoples see Europeans largely as trading partners, as people who bring them goods that they can't get from other locations. It's important to understand, and we'll emphasize this a lot in this lecture and subsequent lectures. Indigenous peoples were, for the most part, welcoming to European explorers, to these and American explorers, to these individuals who came here, primarily because indigenous peoples engaged in trade all the time. And Europeans and Americans were simply different trading partners. They brought goods that could not be acquired any other way. So for the most part, they were quite happy to engage in the trade. If you look at the primary source record, there wasn't a lot of conflict. That's not to suggest there wasn't any conflict, but there isn't a lot of conflict evident in the primary source record between Europeans and American explorers during this 1700s, late 18th, early 19th century time period that we're talking about right now. And that's primarily because A, the numbers were small. The European explorers came in relatively small numbers, and so it wasn't as if their numbers were threatening to indigenous peoples. And they came with the intent to trade, which indigenous peoples welcomed. It was only later, when we get to later periods where there's this mass migration of peoples, that the indigenous tribes of this region begin to understand what is going on, and then they begin to push back, understandably so. But by then, there are forces happening elsewhere in North America that make it very difficult for that pushback to be effective. But we'll get to all of that a little bit later. But I just kind of wanted to frame what we've talked about a little bit before we move on. All right, so let's move on to our story for the day. A third country entered the competition for the Pacific Northwest in the 18th century, and that was Russia. Russia in the 18th century is actually an emerging European power. And some of you, that might sound strange because you think of Russia as this vast country who has played such an important role in the modern world in shaping both European and global affairs. However, Russia, although always a fairly large territorial state, had little impact over the course of the major European kingdoms until the 1700s and into the 19th century. And that's simply because Russia, for a whole host of reasons, but Russia, under the reign of Peter the Great, who becomes Russian emperor, or as Russian emperors are known in Russian, czars, became Russian czar in 1689, and he will remain czar until the 1720s, 1725 officially. And Peter the Great had a notion of modernizing Russia, or at least modernizing Russia's economy and its military. He didn't really want to modernize Russia politically or socially or from a labor perspective, but he wanted to modernize Russia's economy to generate more wealth, modernize Russia's technology, and modernize its military. He wanted Russia to be seen as one of the great powers of Europe. And in the 18th century, the great powers of Europe were creating overseas empires. As we have thought about and talked about, they were creating overseas empires. And so Peter the Great wanted to create such an empire. And so he began to direct Russian attention towards that goal. But Russia couldn't pursue the same kinds of empires as, say, Britain or France or Spain or Portugal or the Dutch and so on and so forth, because Russia was effectively landlocked. It had lots of coastal area, but it didn't really have a warm water port sufficient for a large navy or a large commercial fleet. And so Russia began to move east and exercise more control over its eastern territories and extend those eastern claims all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and then from the Pacific Ocean across to the North American continent. So they began to expand that way under the encouragement of Peter the Great and his successors. So Russia begins to expand east. By 1728, there are Russian settlements, largely fur trappers and fur traders, but Russian settlements in what is now Alaska. And originally, Russia was claimed Alaska was claimed by Russia itself. And Alaska would remain, in the eyes of the Western world, a Russian colony until the 1860s, when the United States purchases Russia from, or purchases Alaska from Russia. So there is a large history of Russian influence in Alaska. So using Alaska as its base, Russia begins to try and extend its claims further south into what is now Canada and into the Pacific Northwest, into places like what is now the state of Washington. Now, that attempt was largely centered around two things. First were fur trappers and fur traders extending south. There is strong evidence that Russian fur trappers and fur traders were in what is now Washington and Oregon, perhaps as far south as what is now California. So they were active here. But the majority of Russian exploration claims are due to the explorations of Vitus Bering. You can see him here on the right. Vitus Bering actually was Danish, but he was an explorer on behalf of Russia, and his Russian partner, Alexei Cherekov. And they made their first explorations in 1728. In 1741, they do a second expedition. These goals were largely about more thoroughly exploring Alaska, understanding the Bering Strait, establishing trading ports, and claiming all land that they came across on behalf of the Russian Empire, which they do. Now, as I've alluded to earlier, Russia is going to have the strongest claims from a Western perspective in Alaska. It is Alaska where Russia's claims are the strongest. But by extension, Russia is extending its claims all the way to the Pacific Northwest. And if you were to be able to conjure a Russian diplomat in the 18th century and even the early 19th century, they would suggest that their territorial claims in Alaska extend all the way down the coast to what is now Washington and Oregon. And they would say that their fur trappers and fur traders were not only active in these areas, but that they have that those activities indicate that they were in Russian territory. Now, to be clear, neither the Spanish nor the British take very seriously Russian claims to the Pacific Northwest. Neither group take them very seriously. But I think it's important to note that Russia does consider the Pacific Northwest an extension of its Alaskan territorial possessions. All right, though. Now we need to get to the fourth major player here, and I do mean major, which is the United States. It's important, though, before we get to the nuts and bolts and specifics of the United States claim, that we understand on some level the context for the American claim. And I want to make it clear to you that it would be easy to assume it was inevitable that the United States would claim the Pacific Northwest. After all, the vast majority of the Pacific Northwest ended up in American possession. So as a consequence, it would be easy to slip into some sort of like historical fallacy that it was inevitable that this was going to happen. It wasn't inevitable. It was a result of and a consequence of important developments that took place in the late 18th and early 19th century that we need to have a conversation about, and we will have a conversation about in the next several minutes. But I just want you to disabuse you of this inevitability concept that sometimes people bring to the table when they think about all the lands within North America that ultimately ended up in American possession. It wasn't inevitable that that would be the sequence of events. It's just how things worked out historically based on certain factors that you explore in this class and explore in more broader U.S. history classes. So when the British were making their claims to the Pacific Northwest in the 1770s, when Captain Cook was here, right, the United States was fighting the Revolutionary War to have independence and autonomy from Great Britain and the British Empire. The War of Independence was raging on. Ultimately, as we all know, the United States wins that conflict. The military side of that conflict is done by 1781 when the United States wins. It's the final victory at Yorktown. What happens is between 1781 and 1783, there's negotiations in Paris over the terms of that independence, what it's going to look like. And I really want to just talk a little bit about the negotiations and the concept of these negotiations and some of the territorial issues around these negotiations. The colonial endeavor in North America, or more specifically, the English/British colonial endeavor in North America, was not necessarily a planned endeavor. For much of the 1600s, the Crown, meaning the British Crown, looked at the colonial endeavor as an additional source of revenue. And so they were granting charters to groups who were willing to extend English territory and then pay taxes and fees for the charter that would allow them to exploit and govern these lands that they were in possession of. The reason I'm bringing this up is that it's not as if the British looked at a map and said, okay, this is going to be the colony of Virginia. Okay, this is going to be the colony of Massachusetts. Okay, this is going to be the colony of Maryland. Okay, this is going to be the colony of Connecticut and Rhode Island and so on and so forth. They didn't do that. The borders of these colonies with respect to each other. So when we get to ultimately the original 13 colonies, the borders between them were often negotiated between the colonies themselves or simply imposed by the British government. These borders were contentious among the colonists. And one thing you have to understand is it took a while for the colonists to form a unified American identity. Like this concept of, hey, we're Americans. Because first and foremost, they tended to think of themselves as like Virginians or, people from Massachusetts or people from Connecticut or New Yorkers or, whatever the case might be. They tended to think regionally as opposed to a broad colonial identity. And it took a long time for that American sense of identity to form. And one could argue it really took the Revolutionary War and the early Republic to develop that sense of American identity. So individual colonies were as likely to be rivals of one another as they were allies. Why that's important for this story, because I know some of you listening to this right now are thinking, oh my gosh, he's going on another tangent. It might be a tangent, but it is important for the story. By and large, by the time we get to the middle of the 18th century, so when you get to the French and Indian War, which runs from 1754 to 1763, by the time you get to that war, the colonists have largely accepted the imposed boundaries along their northern and southern borders, which means they're largely boundaries with one another, if you will. But where they haven't accepted are their western boundaries. They haven't accepted their western boundaries. That actually is in part what caused the French and Indian War, is Virginia aggressively claiming western territory all the way into what is now modern day Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. It's more complicated than that. You can take a U.S. History 1 class to go through it. But part of the cause of the French and Indian War was Virginia making excessive claims out west. with respect to its colonial territory. And just so you know, a lot of the other colonies didn't agree with what Virginia or other colonies were doing with respect to their western boundaries, particularly colonies like Pennsylvania and New York and the Carolinas, where they had large western boundaries. So what happens is, after the French and Indian War, the British impose a proclamation line, the Proclamation Line of 1763, that says the Appalachian Mountains effectively are the western boundary of these colonies. The colonies didn't like that. Actually, it was a major grievance that the British were limiting their westward expansion, their search for new lands and resources. It was one of the original grievances that the colonies had. But the British, for a variety of reasons, had imposed and said, no, anything west of this line of 1763, that belongs to the British government. It's not part. It belongs directly to the British government. It's some of it was part of Canada, some of it was just not. But regardless, they were denying the 13 original colonies that westward land. When it came time to negotiate the end of the Revolutionary War, there was a desire among colonial leaders to claim a bunch of Western territory. In fact, many colonial leaders believed that their victory should mean they not only got their individual colonies, but they got the Western territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, that territory, and they got Canada. Many colonial leaders wanted all of Britain's North American territories as part of their victory in the Revolutionary War. A couple things about that I just want to mention right now. Thing number one, that tells you that from its very inception and birth, that the United States was an expansionist nation. And therefore, it shouldn't surprise anyone that the United States would expand west in the 19th century. The United States was born out of the British imperial experience. And the country itself was interested in expansion from its very moment of birth, as evidenced by these negotiations. Now, the second point I'd like to make is that the negotiators in Paris didn't think that they were likely to get all the territory that many colonists and colonial leaders were hoping to. In fact, they were pretty pessimistic about getting any of it. What they really wanted to do was secure the colonial borders that had been imposed on 1763 for each colony. They wanted to secure independence for that. They wanted to make sure that the British left and granted full independence to the total colonial territory of the 13 original colonies. Anything else that they got was kind of an added bonus in their eyes. They didn't think that Britain was likely to give them any of it. But they asked for it anyways. They asked for all of it, including Canada, at the negotiations. The British kind of surprised the negotiators by agreeing that the Trans-Appalachian West, so the area from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, that land that they would be willing to concede to the new United States. Not Canada. They did not concede Canada, but they said the rest of it, sure, all yours. You can have it. Which means that when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, and the United States is officially a new country, it was basically double the size of the original colonies that revolted. Now, that created all sorts of issues with respect to politically and territorially and legally the status of these new territories that the early American that the early American government had to figure out. That's a story for a different class. You can take a different class to understand that. But it created issues that had to be resolved. It also created issues with respect to the border in Canada, because there had never been a need for a firm border between Canada and the United States as a result of the fact that it was all, after 1763, British territory. So there was never any need to create a firm border between the New England colonies in Canada, between New York and Canada, and then ultimately around the area of the Great Lakes. Well, now there is a need. I'm bringing this up now because the need to create a border between British Canada and the new United States will have profound consequences for the Pacific Northwest. We're not going to talk about it at the moment because it's not chronologically appropriate. But I do want you to be aware that this need for this border will play a role in what happens in the Pacific Northwest. That's one of the reasons I'm mentioning it. So, we now have a new United States that is double the size of the territory that revolted against Britain. And it is now imperially minded, expansionist minded. And there's a huge nationalistic fervor that sweeps the United States in the 1780s and 90s and into the early 19th century. And there's this huge desire to compete with Great Britain. And so as a consequence, the United States engages in this competition for markets, for resources, for territory. With respect to the Pacific Northwest, the first American explorer to come here and make claims is a gentleman named Robert Gray. Robert Gray. He was from New England, and he's kind of a merchant, a little bit of a fur trader, an explorer, all rolled into one. A lot of these explorers are sort of, they're businessmen cum explorers cum quasi agents of the state. They have this kind of nebulous area that they exist in. So Robert Gray comes out to the Pacific Northwest. He's inspired by the expeditions of Captain Cook. He's read Cook's diaries, which were in journals, which were widely published. Even in his own lifetime, Cook's journals were published. And so afterwards, they're well in print, and so they were available in the United States. And so Gray has these and begins to come to this area to explore and make claims. Perhaps Gray's most important exploration up here is what he did on the Columbia River. So I'd mentioned the Columbia River earlier. I'd mentioned that Spanish explorers had come here and seen the river but not really gone up it, and they named it the San Roque River. In 18th and 19th century exploration, there's two things about river exploration that you should be aware of. The first thing you should be aware of is if you wanted to claim a river as belonging to your particular country, you needed to either claim the source of it or the mouth of it. Either of those would allow you to claim the river and then the lands that sort of extended beyond the river. And so Gray is going to spend a significant time exploring what had been named the San Roque River. But unlike the Spanish, he goes up the river. He sees it's a massive mouth. In fact, the mouth of the Columbia River is enormous. The Columbia River is a very large river anyways, but its mouth is even bigger than a river. It's actually bigger than you would expect for a river the Columbia size, and the Columbia River is a very large river. But he sails up it, something like 20 miles, and he finds that this river is very, very navigable, which is in 18th and 19th century terms, really good for trade. And as he's sailing up the river and documenting and mapping everything he sees, he decides he's going to name the river. And he names it after his ship, and his ship is called the Columbia, so he names it the Columbia River. And this is actually a very powerful claim that the U.S. is staking to this region. And so it's and this is the first time the United States has made a claim to any land west of the Mississippi River. So this is a really big deal. However, the bulk of American claims in the Pacific Northwest has to do with the Louisiana Purchase and the subsequent expeditions of Lewis and Clark. So that's what we need to spend the rest of this lecture about. So we first need to talk about the Louisiana Purchase, which necessitated the creation of the Corps of Discovery, which was the expedition of Lewis and Clark. So let's have that conversation. I want to take you to 1803. The United States is a pretty brand new country with an even newer constitution. I think that's something that people don't appreciate, is that the United States became a country. We tried a specific kind of democratic republic. It didn't work, so we scrapped it and tried a new one under the current constitution that we have now, or at least the current constitution we have without many of the amendments that would come later to that constitution. The United States is still trying to figure out how it governs itself. In 1803, we're only on our third president, Thomas Jefferson. And to be honest, there's been some dysfunction. The first two presidential administrations, which were the administrations of George Washington, his first and second term, they went relatively smoothly in terms of electoral politics, but the country became really divided politically because political parties developed, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So you have a situation where politically some contrasting views of the future of America are being drawn and played out in our politics. There's also some pretty big social gaps within individual states, but then also between northern and southern states. You also have a country that's trying to figure out what it's trying to be, what its political identity is going to be, what its economic identity is going to be, what its military identity is going to be. It's a country trying to figure things out. And the election of 1796 was a hotly contested election with an end result that was somewhat controversial. And the election of 1800, the election in which Thomas Jefferson became president, actually was in some ways as dysfunctional and contested as the election of 1796. So the United States has got some issues it's trying to figure out. And then the United States has got to understand and establish its place within the world. It's now no longer part of the British Empire. It's its own country competing for markets and industries with the British Empire, but also highly dependent upon the British Empire. This is something that people don't appreciate, but southern states, which were largely moving towards cotton production on their plantations, which were worked by black slaves, that plantation system was contingent on Great Britain buying plantation goods, especially cotton. Southern states were dependent on British mills to be the main consumers of their cotton. So the Industrial Revolution, which is beginning and accelerating in Great Britain is contingent on slave labor in the American South and in other places as well. So there is a real interesting dynamic going on in the country at this time as the United States is trying to find its place in the world. I think the other thing you have to understand too is that the early 19th century is incredibly tumultuous because the French Revolution has happened in Europe, and that revolution is enormously consequential for the history of Europe. In terms of sheer global impact, the French Revolution has much more consequence than the American Revolution ever did. And so the French Revolution and its aftermath and the conflicts it's causing in Europe are looming really, really large on the global stage. And the United States is aware of what's going on and trying to figure out what it's supposed to be doing about it. So we have this situation where the conditions in Europe are tumultuous. And you have a United States which is expansionist, but also trying to find its footing in the world. The United States also has a geographic problem. So if you recall moments ago, I talked about the United States doubling its size with the Treaty of Paris. They had ended up with a Western territory that was not part of any other colony. That Western territory being between, west of the Appalachian Mountains, but east of the Mississippi River. So between those two geographic features. Now that land, through various government policies, has either become territories, so territories that are on their way to becoming states, or actual states. But regardless, it's American soil. But there's a problem with that territory in the West that isn't evident when you just look at a political map. But if you looked at a topographic or physical feature map, would become glaringly obvious, which is the land is divided. The country itself is divided by the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the Appalachian Mountains aren't very tall mountains. They don't have high elevations like the Rockies or the Cascades. But they're tall enough, and even to this day, but especially at this time, they're heavily, heavily forested. And there was no real way to transport goods by cart. There was no road system to get you from the Western territories over to the established older states, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, etc. So, if you wanted to move goods or soldiers or communicate between the two halves of the United States, the Mississippi River was the key. Even though the Mississippi River was the far western boundary of American territory, it was the key to connecting the two halves of the United States. Because you couldn't move across land, so everything, communication, goods, people, military troops, they had to be moved either, if you wanted to go from west to east, you had to get onto the Mississippi River, go south on the river, so downriver, out the port of New Orleans, into the Gulf of Mexico, and then go wherever you were going to go. If it was Georgia, New York, it didn't matter, but that's how you did it. And then, if you wanted to go to, say, like what is now Ohio, you had to do the reverse, right? So if you want to go from New York City to Ohio, you went down the coast of the United States, into the Gulf of Mexico, through the port of New Orleans, up river to where St. Louis is, and then like up the Ohio River to what is now Ohio. But the Mississippi River is the key. And the key to controlling the Mississippi River is the Port of New Orleans. The Port of New Orleans acts like a choke point. Whoever controls New Orleans controls the river itself. Traffic going downriver has to go through the port, and traffic going upriver has to go through the port. And if you fortify it well enough, it's a choke point. You can control it. Therefore, in order to keep the Mississippi River open for goods, people, and communication to move between the two halves of the United States, it's key to have access to the port of New Orleans. From 1763 to 1801, the port of New Orleans was under Spanish control. Spain had allied with the British during the French and Indian War. Just so you know, the French and Indian War in Europe is known as the 7 Years' War because it starts in 1756 and goes until 1763. So Britain and Spain had been allies during that war. And since Spain was on the winning side, they got what was known as the Louisiana Territory. And Louisiana Territory was basically what is now the Great Plains, all the way, so like from Oklahoma all the way to the Canadian border to the Rocky Mountains. And it also included Louisiana and the port of New Orleans. So Spain got that. Spain and the United States had relatively good relationships after independence. Spain and the United States had a relatively good relationship. Also, Spain was a relatively weak colonial power by the 1790s and 1800s. They're dealing with rebellions and resistance to their own colonial rule in what is now Mexico and Central America and South America. So they got their own issues holding on to their existing colonies and in the Caribbean. On top of that, they have the French Revolution going on, and that revolution is at their doorstep. And so they're very concerned about the resources it takes to prevent the revolution from spreading into Spain or to contain the revolution within France. They're kind of part of an alliance that's concerned about this. So Spain has decent relationship with the United States, and it doesn't have the capability nor the desire to restrict American access to the port of New Orleans. However, things change in 1801. In 1801, Spain cedes the Louisiana Territory, including the port of New Orleans, to the French. It's important to understand why and the consequence. The why of it is, for the purposes of this course, just simple. It was an attempt to buy peace with the leader of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. He's not Emperor Napoleon at this point, but he's just a couple years from that, and he's the unquestioned leader of France, and he's their main military general. This was Napoleon basically demanded this territory in exchange for not invading Spain, and Spain gave it to him. Ultimately, Spain is going to get invaded later on, but for now, it appeases Napoleon. This changes the calculation for the United States, because the United States has had its relationship with France deteriorate markedly in the 1790s. France and the United States have been great allies during the American Revolutionary War. France is the entire reason the United States gets its independence. Without French support, without its financial support, without its navy, the United States would not have had the capacity to defeat the British. They didn't have a navy that could challenge the British Navy, and they didn't have the financial assets to fund the war. And quite frankly, French military advisors, most famously the Marquis de Lafayette, were the reason that the United States gets its independence. So they'd had a close relationship. That relationship deteriorated after the French Revolution in 1789. The French revolutionaries believed that the United States should support the French Revolution. After all, they had supported our revolution. But George Washington, who was president at the time, steadfastly refused to get involved. Things deteriorated even further in 1798 during what's known as the XYZ affair of the Adams administration, in which the French were seizing American ships abroad. And when the Americans went to complain about this, French officials said, well, for a bribe, we will release the crew and the cargo. And that deeply offended the Americans. And this was known as the XYZ affair because in the press, it was reported as official X, official Y, and official Z. This led to the quasi-war in which Britain and the United States basically made an alliance to use kind of like their respective navies to force the French to stop seizing ships and impressing soldiers. It worked with respect to that issue, but it did generate a further deterioration in the relationship between France and the United States. So you can understand, given what had happened over the last decade, the trepidation that Thomas Jefferson, the President of the United States, feels now that France controls this territory. So immediately, Jefferson dispatches ambassadors to France and says, you need to buy the port of New Orleans. We can't trust that the French aren't going to basically create forts in New Orleans and block our access to the river. Because if they will block our access to the river, we can't have it, like the western part of the United States will be cut off. And that would leave it vulnerable to conquest by the French or the British. So Jefferson says immediately we need to go purchase the port of New Orleans. So he dispatches negotiators to go to the port of New Orleans. So these negotiators go to Paris. Their sole mandate is to buy the port of New Orleans. That's it. Buy the port of New Orleans. That's all Jefferson says. However, when they get there, they find that Napoleon doesn't want the territory at all. See, the fear in America was that this would be a return French presence in North America. But from Napoleon's perspective, he ended up with land that he really couldn't occupy and he couldn't defend. Napoleon had built a massive and very impressive military machine in France, a land army. But he didn't have the naval capacity to match the British. And without that naval capacity to match the British, there was really no way for the French Navy to get west to help protect and populate lands like the Louisiana Territory. So Napoleon considered this land just an asset that he could flip for what he really wanted, which was cash. So Napoleon says, I'm going to I'll sell this whole thing to you for 15 million US dollars. Well, that's ultimately the price they settled on. That's not where they started. But for the purpose of this class, right, ultimately that's the offer, is an exchange. Now, the negotiators are both thrilled and petrified. They really don't know what to do here because they've only been authorized to buy the port of New Orleans. And by the way, that authorization was a little bit dubious to begin with because there's a constitutional issue here. Did Jefferson have the constitutional authority to actually do this? It is actually a question that was debated in its own time and still debated today. But regardless, Jefferson said, I'm going to do it using what's called the necessary and proper clause. He decides that authority from Congress gives him the power to negotiate things. And so as a consequence, he thinks that constitutionally, if Congress agrees with him, he can figure this out. But he just acts. But now, right, you have these negotiators who were only authorized to do New Orleans, and now they're talking about a much bigger arrangement. And there's 3,000 miles of distance, and there's no texting, there's no Snapchat, there's no social media. They could write a letter and then wait months for it to get there and months for a response, and they don't know how good this offer is. So they take it. They take it and they say, if we'll live with the consequences. So they take it. And the United States territory is doubled once again. By the way, Jefferson was thrilled. And most people in America seem to have been in favor of the acquisition. It's important to note that the United States now, from an international perspective, owns this land. But there are indigenous peoples that live on this land. And now they are under this expansionist United States. The other thing that's important to recall here is that the Louisiana Territory did not include the Pacific Northwest. It did not include the Pacific Northwest. But Jefferson was determined to extend American territory to the Pacific Ocean. But now he's got to decide what to do with this land. Ultimately, what he decides to do is the core of discovery. One thing you need to be aware of is that Jefferson, in addition to being our third president and the author of the Declaration of Independence and a figure of enormous political consequence in American history, he was also a scientist. He was interested in a wide range of intellectual activities, and especially science. He's also interested in languages and anthropology and philosophy and ethics. He's interested in lots of things, wide-ranging mind. But he was very much interested in science. And so when he was thinking about the land that had been acquired and what the United States should ultimately do with it, he approached it scientifically. And he approached it as a scientific inquiry to discover plants and animals and minerals and geography and so on and so forth. He wanted to know everything he could about this land scientifically to then create sort of a plan for what America should do with this territory. How America could encourage settlement and exploitation of whatever resources were there. And keep in mind, nobody really knows what's there. The interior of the North American continent was known only to indigenous peoples. Very few Europeans or Americans had ever been in any of that territory, and none that we know of had ever been fully across it. So this is unknown to non-indigenous peoples. Not indigenous peoples, it's the land they lived in. Of course they knew it. It's their land. It's the land they lived on. It's their ancestral homeland. But to Americans and Europeans, it was an unknown land. So Jefferson used to plan for this. Jefferson probably would have liked to have gone on this scientific expedition himself, but the reality and demands of being president meant that he couldn't. So what he does is he picks his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. And Meriwether Lewis, he makes the captain of this expedition, the person in charge of it. Okay? He makes him the person in charge of it. And so what he does is he has him trained. He trains him himself in all the sciences and disciplines that he knows. And when he doesn't think he has the expertise, he sends Meriwether Lewis to other experts, like at the Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia. Academy of Sciences ultimately became the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which is an Ivy League school. So he sent him to the experts around the country to have further education. So Meriwether Lewis was trained in almost everything Jefferson thought would be appropriate for this mission. He was actually, in Jefferson's mind, if he couldn't go, Meriwether Lewis was the perfect person to go. But Lewis had attributes that Jefferson never had. And Jefferson was kind of a child of a plantation. He owned a plantation. He grew up on a plantation. He was not a person who had spent much time on the quote-unquote frontier, where you didn't have the modern conveniences that he was used to. Meriwether Lewis was. He was from Virginia, but he was from the western part of Virginia, the part that was very much did not have the infrastructure and conveniences associated with other parts of Virginia. So he kind of grew up in a more, in an environment where having outdoor skills and survival skills was necessary for everyday life. So he had those kind of skills that Jefferson would not have had. He was also a military veteran, Meriwether Lewis was. So Jefferson puts him in charge and says, here's your budget. Do what you need to do to get this expedition up and running. Okay? So Meriwether Lewis is kind of charged with getting this expedition going after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So the purchase happens in 1803. And then Meriwether Lewis is in charge of kind of getting this expedition together. The first person that Meriwether Lewis contacts about going with this is an old army buddy named William Clark. And he says, come join me on this. Technically, Meriwether Lewis is in charge of this thing. He outranks Clark because he's been made the captain of this expedition. But he treats Clark as his equal. And no one else on the expedition will ever know that Lewis outranks Clark. They will collectively make decisions together. But he brings Clark in. And William Clark then begin to plan what will become the Corps of Discovery. So together, they're going to make this journey. So, purchase happens in 1803. Preparations are made in 1803 for this expedition. The expedition heads out in 1804. Now, Jefferson writes a letter to Meriwether Lewis outlining what he wants him to do. Within that letter, Thomas Jefferson describes a whole host of things that the expedition is supposed to achieve, that the Corps of Discovery is supposed to achieve. They all basically, all the things that Jefferson wants boils down to 5 really important things. The first is to collect information on the flora and fauna, the plants and animals. This is about not just science, but economics. What is here to be exploited for the American economy? And to attract settlers. Because ultimately the goal is to settle here. You need to understand that Jefferson's view of the United States was that the United States should be a nation of farmers. Jefferson's view of the United States is that it should be an agrarian nation of family-owned farms. Some larger, like plantations. Some smaller, like just a small family farm. But that's what Jefferson's view of America was, what it should be. And so he needs to understand what plants and animals are there to have a better understanding of what agrarian possibilities or other economic industries are possible. Secondly is to map the physical features in rivers, right? That's important for just infrastructure and economics, but it's also important for exploration, right? You can see here on the map what the Louisiana Territory is, but the boundaries in the west were a little bit ill-defined and the boundaries in the north were a little bit ill-defined. And so you need to map physical features and stuff because maps are part of claims, and Jefferson realizes that claims and negotiations over borders are going to have to be made. The third thing is they're charged with finding the source of the Columbia and Missouri rivers. This is about the Northwest Passage. So this is about the Northwest Passage idea. As I told you in the previous lecture, Captain Cook's expedition had basically, it had proven that there was no Northwest Passage in terms of saltwater seas, oceans. There's no bays, straits, seawater bodies that connected to one another for a Northwest Passage. However, there was still hope that there might be a river network. And it was well known that you had the Mississippi River's mouth going to the Gulf of Mexico at the port of New Orleans. It was also understood that at St. Louis, which was the furthest west town in the United States, that at St. Louis, the Missouri and Mississippi rivers came together. That the Missouri River went somewhere to the northwest. It was also understood, especially after the expedition of Robert Gray, that the Columbia River was a very large river that went pretty far inland. And so the thought was that maybe the headwaters, the source of the Columbia and the Missouri rivers were close to one another. And as a result, you could sail up one portage between them overland a short distance, and then sail down the other, and vice versa. And that would effectively create a waterway through the entire North American continent and create a Northwest Passage. Now, as Lewis and Clark are going to discover, it's not possible. The source of the Columbia River is today in what is now Canada. The source of the Missouri is in what is now Montana. They're separated by something like 1,300 miles. They're nowhere close to one another. But there's a belief at the time that this is possible. To establish good relationship with Native Americans. The United States in the 19th century largely had, in the early 19th century, so in the early 1800s, at the start of the 1800s, largely has a policy of appeasement with respect to Native Americans. The United States can't afford a full-scale war with Native peoples because it doesn't have the military or the resources or the tax base to do so. And so the United States is largely pursuing a policy of appeasement, trying to create peaceful relationships with Native peoples within its borders, including now the Louisiana Territory. Now, that doesn't mean individual states aren't usurping indigenous peoples of their land. And it doesn't mean that Native Americans are happy with American policy, because ultimately that's going to be a source for conflict in the War of 1812, which we'll address in the next lecture just a little bit. So, but by and large, American Indian policy at this point is to try and basically recognize Native tribes and allow them to have access to their ancestral homelands anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains, basically. So we want to establish good relationships with Native Americans. But just because you're establishing good relationships doesn't mean that you aren't making imperialistic claims and telling Native Americans that their land now belongs to the United States. And it also doesn't mean you aren't trying to change their lifestyle. If you read the documents of what Lewis and Clark are charging Native peoples to do, or charging what Thomas Jefferson is charging Lewis and Clark to tell Native peoples, it is really about a lifestyle change. Jefferson wants Lewis and Clark to basically let them know that they're now part of America, and America is going to be expecting a lifestyle change for indigenous peoples. Fifth, push American claims to the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest is not part of Louisiana Territory, but Jefferson very much wants one of the primary goals of the expedition to be stake American claims to the region. I'm not going to spend a lot of time overviewing the actual expedition to you, but I just want to briefly describe it. So they left St. Louis in 1804. It took them a long time to travel up the Missouri River, fighting the current. Eventually, they stop at a place called Fort Mandan, and there they winter with the Mandan Indians. While at Fort Mandan, they meet a French fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, who tells them that he knows all the mountain paths, all the river systems. He knows the way of the Pacific Ocean. And so they say, great, we're going to hire you as a guide. Well, it turns out that he doesn't know much of anything. But he is married to a Shoshone woman who had been captured in war and brought to the plains. The Shoshone are a tribe in what is now like Idaho, parts of Montana, and down into like parts of Wyoming, parts of Oregon, parts of Nevada. So the Shoshone tribe is a really big, powerful tribe in the Pacific Northwest. And Charbonneau is married to this Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, or Sacagawea. Sacagawea is now the more accepted pronunciation of her name. And she has a young child by Toussaint Charbonneau. And she does know the way. And she speaks languages that allow the Corps to communicate with local tribes. And also because she's a woman with child, and traditionally Native peoples did not bring women and children with them on war parties. The fact that she's there with her child indicates to tribes, whether Lewis and Clark understood this or not, that they were not a threat. And so she's really one of the keys, if not the most important key to the success of this expedition. But it wasn't. And even Lewis and Clark in their journals will say, yeah, her husband was useless, but she was really, really valuable. So they set out in the spring of 1805 up the Missouri River again. They find the source of it, but they don't find the source of the Columbia because it's not there. They spend a lot of times sort of fruitlessly and desperately in the Bitterroot Mountains. And they might have struggled and been really in a dangerous spot come winter, because it's the fall. It's getting close to the fall of 1805, and they're really running into problems. And they can't find their way through through the Bitterroot Mountains when they encounter a Shoshone tribe. And as fate would have it, it's the same band of Shoshone that Sacagawea was from. And in addition to being the same band, her brother is now the chief of that band. And he is overwhelmed at being reunited with his sister, and he provides supplies and horses and guides through the mountains. Ultimately helps them reach the Clearwater River. From the Clearwater, they move quickly downstream to the Snake. From the Snake, they move downstream to the Columbia. While in what is now southeastern Washington, they enjoy the hospitality of the Nez Perce Indians. There's a famous Nez Perce story, an oral tradition. Whether it's true or not, it's hard to know, but there's an oral tradition that spread among the Nez Perce by the late 19th century that they'd had a serious meeting about whether or not to kill Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. And just so you know, Lewis and Clark's expedition includes 29 other people. So there's 31 people total on this, right? And so the Nez Perce really have a conversation, according to this oral tradition, about whether or not to harm them, and ultimately they decide to help them. So they provide hospitality, and they also provide supplies and boats to get them down to the mouth along the Columbia River. And they move very quickly along the Columbia River to the mouth to the Pacific Ocean. There, excuse me, there they spend the winter of 1805, 1806 at a structure they built called Fort Clatsop. You can visit a recreation of it today, probably close to the area where it was, but we're not entirely certain exactly where it was. But it's on the Oregon side of the mouth of the Columbia River. They spend the winter there. And then in the spring of 1806, they begin to move the return journey. So they move up the Columbia River. When they reach effectively like near the border with Montana, the expedition splits. One group goes overland and explores what is now Yellowstone, and another group goes and explores more of central Montana. They meet again on the Missouri River and then go home to St. Louis. Now, along the way, Lewis and Clark created massive amounts of journals describing the Native Americans that they saw, describing and sketching out plants and animals. They created enormous maps that were quite accurate, both down to distance. And in fact, Lewis and Clark created detailed mileage of their journey without any equipment, without sophisticated equipment. And so, without sophisticated equipment, they were able to sort of do this. My apologies. As I'm taking this lecture, my emergency alert system went off on my phone. So I apologize for you having to hear that. So anyway, so they create these elaborate maps with accurate mileage. And it's something like they eyeballed all of this because they didn't have the equipment to measure this. And so they eyeballed this, and by the end of it, they were basically within 40 miles of the distance that, something like 40 miles of the distance of the actual journey, just by eyeballing it, which is pretty incredible. So they create lots of journals, lots of material. Some of it they ship back when they encountered people on the river or when they're at the coast. They bargained with trading ships that they encountered, European trading ships they encountered to take it back. But the fact of the matter is, Jefferson hadn't heard, none of that stuff had reached back to Jefferson at all. And Jefferson basically thought that the Corps was a failure, that they were dead. And actually, he sent another expedition out, and this one went sort of like south. He wanted it to avoid where Lewis and Clark had gone, because he's like, whatever happened to them, they died. Maybe they were killed by native peoples, but let's go a different route. So he actually sent another expedition out because he thought this was a disaster. So ultimately, of course, the expedition returned. Only one person died on the expedition, and that person died of appendicitis. So they would have likely died anyways because there was no treatment for that back then. And so they had achieved everything that Jefferson had asked of them. And Jefferson, when he heard about their success, was just overjoyed. You can see here a selection from the Lewis and Clark journals on this slide here. So from an American perspective, the Corps of Discovery was an enormous, enormous success. But regardless of how you view this, the historical impact is undeniable. And you can boil it down to sort of four things. First, the United States this expedition helps the United States engage in territorial expansion. They claim the Pacific Northwest. That doesn't mean that the Spanish and the Russian and the British aren't still claiming the Pacific Northwest. They are. But America is now state to claim. And as a result of the expedition of Lewis and Clark, they have as strong a claim as anyone in terms of this international understanding. Second, you have the first detailed maps and accounts of the interior of the North American continent. These maps, these accounts will be the basis for fur trappers and fur traders, for missionaries, and for later pioneers to come into this area, to come into this land. So this will be the basis for later economic development and settlement. There's a strong American claim to the Pacific Northwest, as I mentioned. And lastly, it's a disastrous legacy for the native peoples of the Western United States. The Lewis and Clark expedition would not have succeeded without the help of native peoples. Native peoples provided the guides, the shelter, the supplies, the safety. Yes, if you get into the details of the trip, there are certainly moments of conflict with native peoples, but they were few and far between. Overwhelmingly, native peoples assisted this expedition. Yet this expedition will be the start of a disastrous 19th century for native peoples, as we will talk about in other units in this class. All right, it was a very long lecture. I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.